done before, and I think
Nice.
we can borrow from neuroscience into further understanding exercise responses, exercise adaptations. These are the kind of things that will pioneer healthcare. If something is done with absolute methodological rigor, then there's a question mark on how applicable it is to the real world, because there's no rigor. Good research is supposedly well controlled, but the real world is very far from being controlled. Well, I don't want them touching any weights because I don't need them to be big, I just need them to be able to run across a pitch.
Disclaimer.
Disclaimer, yeah, absolutely. This is definitely not a good advocation for my research, but here we go. So,
Today I'm joined by a special guest. I have Nasir Uddin here, lecturer of neurophysiology from the University of Essex, and we're currently at the University of Oxford to support some of your studies. Pleasure for me because I have known Nasir for the past, I think, 12 years now. And when I first met you, you were doing a lot of research around combat sports. And now you've progressed and evolved towards neurophysiology. I mean, I'd love to know what initially attracted you and what you've been doing over the last few years.
yeah, sure. So I did a lot of combat sports then. I actually was doing a bit of personal training. I don't do that as much now, but I've actually managed to get stuck into research itself. I had basically long-standing migraines for about 7-8 days at a time, which rendered a question of what was going on. I actually had a CT scan, which they found a small cyst in the brain, which from that point onwards I was kind of quite conservative in my approach to sparring. And it made me wonder if sparring was the right way to go about my combat sports training. It then also made me question what combat sport practices were around, for example, taking shots to the head, and you'll find that it varies between coaches. Some are all game for being bashed in the head as many times as possible, whereas others are very conservative and say that you need to limit the amount of impact you're taking to the head. That was already a compelling area for me, so I was very interested in neuromuscular function, anything neuro-related in the field of sport and exercise science. So since then, I did a bachelor's in strength and conditioning. I worked with a few professional teams like Crystal Palace, London Wasps. Did a bit of work with British weightlifting while competing myself. But then did a master's in physiology and now completing a PhD in sports medicine, which I guess it culminates the branches of exercise physiology, neurophysiology, sports injury, and so on. So the field I currently work in is sport and exercise science, but these can branch into, I'd say, sports medicine, exercise physiology, and neurophysiology. We went from researching combat sports athletes, specifically in their training modalities and their training methods, but then we've moved towards monitoring brain responses in relation to different modalities of training, specifically seen in combat sports. So dehydration being a factor, using heat to induce dehydration, repetitive head impacts, rapid weight loss to reach a certain weight class. And when you combine all of those things, what is the brain undergoing during that period of time? And one of the particular methods that we're using is called non-invasive brain stimulation, which is a way of looking at real-time information of what the brain is doing in terms of communicating to the muscle itself, and then what the output looks like on a screen. So if you think about things like neuroimaging methods such as MRI, that may take about 45 minutes to an hour to acquire, whereas brain stimulation generally gives you that information within seconds or milliseconds, but it's a different modality of looking at the brain.
Since then, you've been doing a bit of research with Oxford.
Yeah.
What is some of the most recent work that you've done before you came here, and what are you up to right now?
Sure. So I've been in sport and exercise science for some time, but I've liked to dabble in and out of that. So I did a bit of clinical research. So prior to my post at University of Essex, I was actually at Queen Mary University, where I was working as a physiologist in a biobank which looked at the Southeast Asian population. And what they wanted to do was understand why that specific demographic was at a higher predisposed risk to certain illnesses like diabetes. And while you could answer things like food being an obvious factor, there were many other factors at play, and this particular biobank focused on genetics. So that was some research that I did. When I moved to University of Essex, it was actually more focusing on neurophysiology, pioneering methods related to non-invasive brain stimulation, electromyography, high definition electromyography, and some of these methods which can really probe into how does the brain respond to different modalities of exercise, but also what could determine force production, what could determine changes to the brain longitudinally across an athlete lifespan. Some of my research here in Oxford actually is following on from a study that has been started up from before, so by PhD students here before, and what they're looking at is using novel imaging methods such as MRI, but specifically magnetic resonance spectroscopy. You can visualize the concentration of a certain neurometabolite in the brain. In this particular instance, we're looking at neurotransmitters such as glutamate and GABA, which are responsible for excitatory and inhibitory activities in the brain. And then we want to see how is that involved in adapting or retaining a task. And we'd like to see how those metabolites change over time in acquiring these new skills. The overall take-home message from these kind of studies tends to be related to motor learning and how do people acquire new skills. So for example, if you're recovering from a stroke, it'd be interesting to know what part of the brain is more involved in helping you acquire new skills that you potentially lost after that stroke. So those are the implications from some of these studies, and that's slightly different from exercise science, and it's nice to have a balance of both.
It's incredibly diverse from what you were doing before, and
Yeah.
I mean, knowing the gap between the time we'd met and what you've been up to now.
Yeah, what I can definitely say is the ability to understand what regions of the brain are most affected, for example, then allows you to understand what can be done to potentially retrain the brain and get someone back to recovery or recovering a lot faster. And the way to probe that is potentially to look at certain skills and what they can do to improve brain function. So for example, if it's well known that a finger tap method is a good way of improving manual dexterity, that's potentially one method of doing it. But actually, some of these new skills that I eventually tested over time might find that certain types of e-games or certain types of specific movements that are involved in, like let's just say a joystick task, can actually probe that brain pathway faster than the old school well-known finger tap method. And that actually can improve recovery. It could have implications for digital forms of recovery where the NHS can provide a service that can be done remotely, for example. And these are the kind of things that will pioneer healthcare and eventually allow for less wastage, less resource utilization, improved outcomes for patients, but on top of that, being able to understand how to help these people get better.
And now looking at the evolution of your involvement in neurophysiology, how has that progressed into your current study in neuroimaging, but also to your work within kind of fitness technology?
It's shown me that there's so much to still be understood. For a long time, exercise science studies have been based on things like electromyography, so EMG, and that tells you a little bit about muscle activation. But the interesting thing is that actually starts off from the brain, and our ability to understand from the origin point of activation to the end point, which is the muscle output, what is going on in that brain to muscle pathway. And that's what non-invasive brain stimulation and other neurophysiological techniques can probe into, which hasn't been done before. And I think
Nice.
we can borrow from neuroscience into further understanding exercise responses, exercise adaptations, prescription for specific populations, and so on.
What is something that you're actually really excited to see in the future when it comes to development of technology in neurophysiology, be it exercise science, be it combat sports? Is there something that you've had your eyes on that you want to know more about?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so I've recently been awarded a grant by the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council, which allows me to actually utilize instrumented mouthguards into mixed martial arts. And it's a really exciting project that I hold close to my heart because going to hopefully be able to get these findings out one day. And the idea is we've gone so far from using a standard jelly gum shield, which just was previously boiled and then fitted into your mouth to just protect your jaw, to now having triaxial accelerometers and gyroscopes in them that are immediately giving information to your phone as a receiver of everything that your head's gone through from a kinematic standpoint.
Wow.
And that is an absurd advancement in technology. Now, whether it can be used for diagnostics is still a big question, and that would be my job as a researcher to eventually answer. But it's just incredible to see that being used in real-time efforts in the world, because you can create technology that is used in the lab in the beginning, but seeing its applicability into the real world is where it really is what you want it to see, and it's the most rewarding part of it. So it's being implemented in rugby as we speak. It's never been really implemented into combat sports, and I think because combat sports and the nature of the type of movements are also quite difficult to understand, so there needs to be some standardization processes involved. So I'm really excited to see how that pairs up with other methods that I've been using, like non-invasive brain stimulation, to see if these immediate changes that we see on a screen from brain to muscle pathway outputs can potentially correlate with what we're seeing in immediate real-time head kinematics, and then eventually see if that if that data is somewhat reliable and accurate to be used to potentially predict information for the future. So, for example, can we predict a threshold for concussions or mild traumatic brain injuries? And that would be really interesting to see. But there's been some studies that I looked at, for example, heading in football and how that actually results in acute changes in brain activity. But we know heading, in comparison to being hit in the head in boxing or MMA, is nowhere near the same. And to be able to take state-of-the-art neurophysiology or neuroscience equipment to the original environment, such as, for example, a combat sports gym, then just gives us true authenticity in being able to study what's going on in its natural environment. So we might be able to actually get a reference value of what we should generally expect in for example, a combat sports gym, in terms of how the brain is responding to X amount of shots to the head. And then that will allow us to maybe look at longitudinal changes across the athlete's lifespan and how that potentially could put them at increased risk of maybe long-term neurophysiological damage, such as Alzheimer's, but also in terms of more, I'd say, short-term outcomes, such as performance outcomes, increased susceptibility to being concussed, as well as, for example, attentional focus and ability to perform tactically.
What is the most surprising thing that you've encountered in your research so far?
There's been some investigations in brain changes, and actually some found improvements in certain brain regions from being involved in combat sports. And one might find that surprising initially, but it's not surprising at the same time, because if you look past the negativity related to repetitive head impacts, which I don't recommend doing so, but if we're talking about the specific situation here, there might be some positive changes in relation to the fact that you are acquiring a new skill. There are tactical and specific elements of training which would improve attentional focus, cognitive function, being able to actually understand certain movements and know how to counter those movements. These are all essentially huge components of motor skill acquisition. So essentially the brain is adapting and getting better from being part of this sport or any type of combat sport. However, that wasn't necessarily related to repetitive head impact, so that could be a completely different area to focus on. We've just completed a study that looks at various dehydration conditions. So we, I'm not very popular in certain parts of London due to this study, but we dehydrated participants by around 5% of their body mass, and that was achieved through sitting in an environmental heat chamber at 40 degrees, Celsius and 40% relative humidity. They cycled for around 3 hours in that condition.
But you had them training in this facility?
Correct, yeah, they cycled sub-maximally for 3 hours in that condition.
Sub-maximally.
Sub-maximally is the key word.
Disclaimer.
Disclaimer, yeah, absolutely. This is definitely not a good advocation for my research, but here we go. So, but essentially, we looked at what happens to their brain after they're dehydrated, and the theory was that if you are dehydrated by a certain amount of water, essentially your body fluids will reduce, and as a result, the cushioning of the brain, which is made up of water, would also reduce, thereby increasing susceptibility to getting injured. But we can't test that functionally. We can't just whack someone's head around a few times and then see what's happening. So we use non-invasive brain stimulation, so transcranial magnetic stimulation, to observe if there was any, neurophysiological or electric changes between the brain to muscle pathway. And what we actually found was really interesting. There was actually no differences in most measures, but we did find on one particular measure, which is a measurement of inhibition. So it's a measurement of increased in silence in the brain for just a few seconds, like milliseconds, in the group that was not dehydrated. So that's really interesting. So what we were expecting to see is potentially this increase in inhibition in the groups that are dehydrated, but instead we found it to be the opposite, where the group that cycled and were able to drink water outside of the heat had this increase in what we call inhibition in the brain, but the two groups that dehydrated themselves and were in 40 degrees heat had no change to that inhibition from baseline. And what we're actually thinking might explain that finding is that when the body undergoes dehydration, the brain might actually go into what we call a compensatory mechanism of sorts to offset the potential damages from losing all that water. So it might actually go into potentially an overdrive of excitability to offset the inhibition that we saw in the group that were not dehydrated.
Wow.
And that was really interesting, because it might then mean that after being dehydrated, the brain has a few processes of trying to compensate, which then leads to other questions as to, like, for example, if you're now getting knocked in the head a few times, what happens to those compensatory mechanisms when the brain's now being challenged, biomechanically as well? So it was a very surprising finding. I did not expect to see that. And it only just further increases my interest in probing into it further.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And knowing what you know now around the impact of repetitive head injury, in the context of combat sports specifically, what are some changes you'd like to see going forward in the way that an athlete is trained, in the way that they recover, in order to safeguard and protect them from injury in the future?
I think the key message has always been trying to understand that training hard is not the same thing as training smart. Training smart is the key and crucial message, I think, that should come from being involved in exercise science. I think it's the whole point of exercise science is being able to understand the nuances of training and how it can be improved, and what is the physiology behind improving exercise prescription and adaptations, and understanding the best way to reach those adaptations. So if anything, especially when it comes to the area of repetitive head impacts, I think you only get one brain, you only have one life. The ability to preserve it is the most important thing that you should be thinking of doing, regardless of what the training outcome should be. So training smart is going to be incredibly important, because at the end of it, especially if you look at it from an athlete's career, once they're done with their athletic career, which is a numbered amount of years, they still need to use their brain for the rest of it, whether that be family life, whether that be business, and essentially taking them all the way to their final years of life, and that requires to still have a healthy functioning brain.
And zooming out a bit away from combat sports to other disciplines where we have seen athletes train incredibly hard in the past and perhaps suffered the consequences of it later on, where recovery might not have been planned as well as it could, and maybe we weren't training smart. Looking at the principles of a general strength and conditioning program for any sport, what are some things that we can do to boost our performance from a neurophysiological standpoint, as well as a performance physical standpoint?
Yeah, good question. So I think the key thing when looking to train smart is going by, I'd say, especially if you know exactly what you want an adaptations driven focus. But when we plan exercise prescription for athletes, one of the things that we have to focus on is a needs analysis. We need to know exactly what they need, because the last thing you want to do is get them training XYZ when really the outcomes are for ABC and they just have no relation whatsoever. Because a lot of the time you'll see athletes training in a certain way and you're like, that actually has no crossover to what they need to eventually be doing. And sometimes it's the opposite, where you see an athlete doing a lot of exactly what they're doing in their sport, but essentially all they're doing is burning themselves out by doing such repetitive movements. So, prime example, you got someone that's preparing for a boxing match and they think that their strength and conditioning program should include over 100 repetitions of landmines where they're just pushing a barbell because it mimics the physical motion of punching. The problem is that's way too sport specific, and eventually that's going to have outcomes that are related to maladaptation. And the reason why is because you've just been focusing on specific movements for too long, whereas you need to actually step back, focus on the needs of your sport or the needs of your goals. If that is, for example, improved endurance, then actually you need to look at what the metrics are for improved endurance. That may be VO2 max, that may be a better respiratory rate, that may be a better run time, a better running efficiency. Those are the metrics that you want to look at first and see how you're going to improve that. And then you can tailor it to be a bit more sport specific. So for example, if we're looking for the gold standard achievement for an endurance test on a bike, then you take that with a pinch of salt, knowing that actually this is still being performed on a bike. How does that translate to being in the ring? But you can still get a very good understanding of what your athlete's endurance profile is by running that test on a bike or on a treadmill, to still get to know where their heart is at or where their cardiovascular system is at. So you have to step back, look at the needs analysis of the individual. You know, if you need to improve physiological endurance, if you need to improve let's just say strength in a particular region, if you need to improve strength endurance in a particular region, you then need to look at the metrics to how you can improve that, how you can actually test that before and after, and then program in accordance to eventually that post-test.
I think we've been seeing a lot over the past 2, maybe 3 years, where when we look at sport-specific training, specificity has meant doing movements that is replicable within your actual contest. But now when we look at specificity, we're looking at the metrics behind it and the way in which you can measure your adaptation or your improvement in exercise when you're looking at respiratory rate or VO2 max. So outside of those intrinsic measurements, what about external factors? How does that impact your position to perform from a neurophysiological standpoint or from a physical performance standpoint? And I'm looking at stress, I'm looking at sleep, I'm looking at mood, I'm looking at nutrition. What are important external factors that we should definitely be keeping an eye on, and how would you look at mitigating those?
Well, interestingly, all of those external factors you've mentioned are just as crucial, if not more crucial, before entering into a training session with tests for those intrinsic factors, because the extrinsic actually determines the outcomes of all of the intrinsic factors. So your ability to, for example, test endurance capacity in a particular session is still dependent on all the external factors that a person is coming in with. Otherwise you find that your retest reliability is all over the place, because actually you got this person when they were fresh at one time and you got this person when they were extremely stressed at another time, and that might not actually be anywhere near related to the physical, the physiological capacity, but it might have just been related to the fact that it's a psychological element. So, for example, they could go on for longer because endurance is heavily based on, your ability to continue from an aspect of resilience, and they might just not have that in that particular session because less sleep, family issues, and so on. People have things going on, and they don't have good days all the time.
Yeah.
And a good training program can adapt to that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's pre-programmed, but it means that there is leeway to understand that, for example, today's just not the day that you might achieve all of those sets, or you might achieve that volume. You might, for example, know that there are certain movements that you can skip out on because you're not feeling your best. You might realise that your athlete does not have the best focus as of today, so you might not go anywhere near ballistic movement or 100% type of movement because it requires skill and it requires precision. And that's just not what your athlete looks like they have today. So your external factors are more important actually than any of the intrinsic factors or any of the physiological metrics, because your ability to achieve those metrics is dependent on controlling to the best of your ability all the other external factors.
What are a few physiological factors that make someone optimize their physical performance in the gym? And that's not just pointing towards minor dehydration, but rather more training protocols they have, recovery mechanisms that are in place.
Absolutely. The most important physiological factors are to actually understand the needs of the individual. You need to know what is expected of the outcome. What are the demands of achieving that outcome? And then once you know that, you know the components of fitness that are involved in achieving that, you can then target the program accordingly. And the physiology behind that is generally you have your standard components of fitness, like for example your endurance, you've got your strength, you've got power, but it's essentially understanding how those interplay into performing whatever movement you're performing or whatever sport you're involved in. And that's where it becomes more specific. So if it's endurance, for example, the endurance required for a half marathon versus a wrestling bout are two very separate things. It doesn't mean that a wrestling athlete does not have any endurance. And it doesn't mean that an endurance athlete, such as a marathon runner, has no strength. It just actually means that the interplay of how they combine training these components of fitness are very different. And these are based on things like muscle fiber types. These are based on things like sport-specific movements.
Okay.
What do they entail? If we're talking about physiological factors, it really depends on the needs of the individual that is performing, and we can base it on that. So, for example, if we're talking about wrestling, we know that ballistic movements are important. We know that they need to have a metabolic capacity to be able to buffer from all the lactic acid buildup that occurs in performing very high, fast, rapid movements, and then needing to recover and then do that again within a short space of time. That's not the same, for example, as someone that runs sub-maximally for about 3 hours at a time. In that particular situation, physiological factors will definitely include nutrition recommendations because of their ability to, or their needs to refuel across the whole race. Whereas that's not the same as an individual who's going to compete for a total period of potentially 6 minutes, but in those 6 minutes they're expected to do repetitive, high-intensity ballistic movements. So the physiology is really dependent on the performance, and the performance is essentially assessed by what we call a needs analysis, and then we can determine what factors are involved.
Can you talk to me a bit about the challenges of balancing scientific research with its actual practical application to the fitness industry?
It's not considered common in our scientific community, and the reason for that is because science communication requires a certain level of confidence and certainty, which us as scientists don't like to and don't tend to have. And the reason for that is because, and the reason it goes back to a question we've had previously, why don't we sell, for example, the research that we sometimes do, and not sell in terms of like commercially, but I mean like get it out there. And it's because we always have this timid certainty about what we're doing being the right thing, because science is, as we know it to be, it's the closest approximation to the truth, but we don't know if it's actually the truth. And every time we get closer to that approximation, we just think we've done the best methodological process of getting there. But it's always with a pinch of salt that we never say we're certain. The applicability of most research is always questioned because at the end of the day, good research is supposedly well controlled, but the real world is very far from being controlled. And that creates a bit of a contradictory statement. It's a bit of an oxymoron, because if something is done with absolute methodological rigor, then there's a question mark on how applicable it is to the real world, because there's no rigor in a real world environment. And that's what makes it quite difficult. And I think researchers who understand the balance between the two can sometimes be the bridge between the two worlds. So in my particular case, I appreciate that combat sports are quite archaic in how they do certain things, because it's almost cultural to some extent, where, for example, cutting weight is considered a rite of passage, as opposed to whether you need to do it is a different matter.
Yeah.
But it's considered a rite of passage. You feel like a fighter because you're cutting weight.
Yeah.
Now, whether you physiologically need to do that is a different matter. It's also just well ingrained in fighters that they have a perceived advantage by being higher in weight than the opponent. And as a result, you need to kind of first understand the demographic or the population that you're working with, so that you can then answer that research question. The problem has to first be something that exists in that world. Otherwise, you're answering questions that no one's asked. And that happens a lot.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point.
So, too often you find a scientific article which a strength coach would look at and be like, well, who asked for that anyway? I know what I'm doing works. It's fine. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's a bit of that, and I think so long as you know what the real world problems are, you can then move on to actually answering it. And it might be that answering it properly requires many steps. So, for example, it might require it in a lab first before you even make a hybrid version that involves participants in and out of the lab, before you can eventually take it out into the real world and experience the full Wild West in terms of trying to answer it. But it's attempting to try to answer a real world problem.
Yeah. And when solid solutions are found to real world problems, irrespective of whether it's been asked before, if it's something that could improve a regimen or improve performance, is there a reason for the reluctance of participants across the fitness industry to accept such kind of changes? Because I suppose you'd see successful athletes who have done things a certain way.
Yeah.
Where does the reluctance to change come from? And are there certain sports in your view that are less reluctant than others to accept that change?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the reluctancy comes from a lot of places. It can come from purely like a nurture type of thing. So, for example, your coach doesn't believe in science, and therefore you now just don't believe in science. But you've also seen them be successful, so therefore you wouldn't question why there would ever be, other than successful. So that could be a case. It could also just be that you've had bad experiences with trying out new things. The margin for error with elite athletes is very, very small. Yeah. So for you to try out a new thing would just be chaotic. There's also the fact that people are very superstitious in sports. They want to stick to things that they know. So for example, if someone says they swear by cupping and they're an elite athlete, you now have a swarm of people that will say cupping is the way to go. And it's not to discredit any particular type of method. It's just the fact that we don't necessarily know if that's a very good method for everyone that wants to use it. So there is a lag behind research and applicability in sports, and that comes down to many factors, but one of the biggest ones is buy-in. Coaches and athletes don't necessarily buy it. They don't necessarily see the benefit in it. And when they do, sometimes there's also other boundaries, such as finance. Can they afford to utilize such a piece of equipment, or can they afford to hire the services that are required to make this right? And it's sometimes the other way around, where I've seen clubs spend money on things that don't necessarily work because they have the money to blow on it. So it's somewhere in the middle. Also, sometimes athletes and coaches sometimes see the science as almost a distractor from the real effort of the work, because they consider what they're achieving is still the end outcome, whereas the science sometimes just complicates it and then allows them to reach the end goal, which is the same, but just gave it more jargon words and terms that they might have already known, but they just they just took 10 steps to get around it. No one's right in this particular case, if I'm being honest, because I have seen cases of where coaches are completely right. Someone's just overcomplicated things in the research, and essentially it's the same outcome. Well, on the flip side, you have seen sometimes coaches that have completely neglected training methods and modalities. Like you've seen footballers, for example, where managers are like, well, I don't want them touching any weights because I don't need them to be big. I just need them to be able to run across a pitch.
Right.
However, their ability to recover from that change of direction and not tear their hamstrings or their ACL is actually dependent on their ability to strength train both agonist and antagonist muscles.
Right.
So there's a bit of give and take, and I think maybe that information has not been well provided.
Yeah.
There are some cases where the research is undisputable, and then we know what the right things are, but there's a lag, as you say, in terms of it being applied in the real world. If you look at the environment that you're in and the I'd say the participants that you're dealing with, so to speak, if you consider it an experiment of some sorts, now it's flipped over. There's a certain timidness from the community that you're trying to implement this with. So, for example, coaches have been well known to do things a certain way based on almost like a feel-how knowledge. They just know, and this intrinsic know-how knowledge that they already have in their heart, or their understanding of movement, is based on just years of experience of observing and coaching athletes for a long time. So sometimes they're not so open to scientific principles or having to study the biology of sport or biomechanics, and for them, they might consider this an overcomplication of a very simple process that they can't explain, but they just know. There's a really interesting game known as Go, and everyone's seen this game, and it was brought up in the Google DeepMind's documentary. Once again, when they approached a whole bunch of very good Go players and they asked them what made you decide that move, there was no standardization of the answer of how did they make that next move. It was just, I just thought that was the best thing to do on a simpler level than Go, based on all the variations you can make for the next move. The community we're working with already has a process in mind of how they work. To come in with physiology and biomechanics jargon sometimes is not welcome, because that's different sometimes to the approach, even though it might say the same thing, or you end up doing the same thing. It's just the process of how people got there.
Yeah.
And that sometimes needs some changing, and that's a lot of the time based on coaching education. But another thing is also in relation to the fact that to make such changes involves implementing new technology, new metrics, new state-of-the-art equipment, which not everyone has the time and money to invest in.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore it's not deemed a welcome addition to an environment which has limped along without it for a long time. When you can somehow change that and improve the overall outlook on exercise science and how it's deemed to support and improve performance outcomes, then I think that lag speeds up certain people.
And it seems that affordability could be a helpful bridge to gap the knowledge and the acceptance that comes with it.
Correct. Yeah, I think if you make something accessible, naturally people are going to try it out more. But with the right guidance, that can potentially work quite well. Sometimes accessibility also makes it very open source, and then everyone uses it and then they interpret it all in the wrong ways because there's no proper guidance towards using it properly and efficiently. So I think it's somewhere in between. I think if something's accessible and there's a lot of guidance out there on how to use it and interpret that information, I think it's a good way to go.
Nice.
To help bridge research and its application.
Totally agree. Both athletes as well as everyday kind of gym goers and people who train at home, whatever it might be. What is a common mistake that you see in a training regimen? Are people overexerting? Are they not resting enough? Are they not eating enough? What is the biggest issue that could easily be resolved for most of the working population?
That's a good question. I think it differs for everyone. With so much access to so much information, I think people get caught up on all the fine details and they forget some of the most basic principles, which is if you do something right and you do it consistently and you do it in small amounts in moderation, you're going to see some changes. You're going to see good adaptations. The maladaptations happen when A, you don't do it enough, or B, you do it too much.
Yeah.
And people just don't find the balance in between, which is do a good amount consistently to eventually see that change. Some people do it far too little, and complain that they don't see a change. And some people do it far too much, for example, and then they maladapt, they get injured, then they start to resent certain things, and then they think that training method didn't work, or they come up with ideas as to this particular movement is something I just can't do going forward. So I think first and foremost it's getting the basics right, and the basics is understanding that good nutrition is important, but don't get bogged down on which particular diet method I should be using. Don't go paleo, whatever. You just need to find something in between, which is moderation. As always, moderation is the key. You ask any scientist what the right method is, and if they give you an exact method, they're probably lying, because it just comes down to it depends. Every single individual is not suited to one particular diet. There's no one size fits all approach. It's finding moderation in all of that. If you've got a clinical condition, then there needs to be a specific approach, but otherwise it's moderation. And that's with training, that's with nutrition, that's with sleep. Recommendation says 8 hours sleep is ideal. Real life scenarios tell you you're not going to get 8 hours. It's finding the moderation like that. You might get 6, but try consistently get 6. If you don't get 8, don't get bogged down by it, but then don't try to get 8 and then get 2 on another day. It's being consistent and doing things in moderation that will eventually allow you to see results and adapt as opposed to maladapt. But nowadays it's very difficult for people to stick through that without sometimes losing a bit of steam on the way. And I think that's honestly, like, if we move away from the science and everything else, it's just people finding a routine that they're comfortable with and can stick with, and then they'll find that all of these principles just kind of come as they go along.
In the pursuit of that type of personalized adaptation that is unique to you and unique to me, what are some ways that you can look for that at an early stage without getting bogged down in the details of it or concern about what is working for you and what isn't? What's going to keep you on track when there's so many different ways in which you can move?
I think to start off with, you've got to be honest with yourself in terms of what you can do, what you can give to any particular, let's just say for example you're starting a new program. Be honest with yourself in terms of what time you can give, what type of equipment do you have available with you. You could think of all the best case scenarios. I can magically think of Lloyd's gym which has everything to my availability, but if I live in Forest Gate, I know Lloyd's gym is nowhere near me, so I need to plan for what I have and make the best of that.
Technology as a whole has been evolving a lot in the fitness space, and one thing when we look at specific metrics that are measurable over a period of time in order to track adaptation, what are some kind of key changes that you've been noticing in fitness, with be it wearable technology or different platforms or apps or websites that are actually taking into account these metrics and helping us to be more cognizant of our health outside of performance, just from a general standpoint? Because me personally, I wear a Fitbit. I think Whoops are becoming really popular, and Apple Watches as well. Other metrics that are carried on these in terms of like your sleep or some estimation of your blood oxygen saturation or your VO2 max, are these helpful in the context of your training to look on your phone or your watch? But is there a way to actually implement them into your training routine and improve your performance with a holistic standpoint of all of the data that you have?
Sometimes there are some metrics that can help. I think for sure, knowing a general guesstimate of where you are in terms of caloric expenditure for the day, being able to track what you've eaten and then add up the caloric intake for the day. These are good metrics to help you kind of regulate and understand what you've been doing and what the trend is of what you've been doing. Certain metrics I will take with a pinch of salt, and that's just because I at the moment do not necessarily understand how your phone or watch could potentially get that measurement to the best of its ability. So, like for example, blood oxygen saturation is a question mark for me. I don't know how reliable or accurate such measurements are. And if I'm being completely honest, I don't know how useful that is for the average user, because it's a metric that tells you about oxygen saturation, which can vary based on very many scenarios, and there's not much you can do with that information in the immediate sense. So
what type of information could you take and make good use of? And it might be something as simple as looking at your sleep stages overnight, or looking at a change in your resting heart rate.
Yeah. So I think a resting heart rate is definitely a nice indicator of where you are in terms of overall fitness. It might not be considered the gold standard, but I think it's a very available metric that can be used to just help understand what the average is and where you are against the average, and why is that always, for example, higher than average when you're at complete rest on the sofa watching telly for the last 2 hours. And that might give you an indicator as to, how much your heart is working more than it might need to. That's useful information. I think sleep stages, once again, that can vary. It depends. Technology is as good as people, interpret it sometimes and also use it. I think sometimes people might gather metrics that have not necessarily been used efficiently. So for example, they might look at sleep cycles on one night but not wear the watch on many other nights, and therefore not have a full understanding of things. And also, when you compare across different apps, they use different equations to actually measure these things. So for example, one might have an algorithm which looks at a heart rate of a certain value versus another which actually just looks at phone use time, and then as soon as it realizes the phone's not being used for X amount of time, it presumes you're in a sleep cycle of some sort. So it depends on how it's measured, but I think each to their own. If someone, like, you'll find a lot of this is extremely based on user preferences. So for example, if someone takes some positive outcome from it by knowing, for example, they've had X amount of sleep for the past week, and that on average needs to be a little higher, and that might explain low mood, that might explain increased risk of injury, then great, they have something to correlate it with, and they might potentially use that for good information. On the flip side, sometimes that information just might make people feel worse, you're now constantly being reminded of the fact that you have 4 hours sleep or 4 hours of quality sleep. And sometimes if that information is wrong based on algorithms or inaccurate, sensing, then that also can be dangerous. So for example, some people are being told they only have 2 hours of quality sleep. Whether that information is correct or not, and the fact that they've had 8 hours sleep is relevant or not, is important, but it might make people paranoid as to, how do they improve that sleep now? What do they do? What do they do that's different? What are they doing that's wrong? Or they might start, blaming that for other things.
I agree. I think these industries overload a ton of information onto their users and then give them no tangible steps to actually implement. And this is where I think technology will evolve over the next few years, and I think coaches will also evolve to begin using more specific metrics that are measurable on a user's adaptation, and then actually drawing links between their sleep or their stress in order to optimize their performance. Is that an area that you think will be of use to the everyday person, or is it something that should be more isolated towards sport-specific athletes? And I'm looking at a coach tracking your sleep or your nutrition or your mood or your heart rate, and then looking at the relevant adaptations to make based on your performance on any given day.
The answer is it could be beneficial to everyone and anyone, but I think those who have the privilege of being able to invest time in making all those changes may tend to be the athletes, because that's essentially what they're paid to do or they're expected to do. It would be considered their job or their lifelong ambitions to optimize that, whereas the average person may want to optimize those things, and I think it's useful to have that information. But the reality is, life doesn't allow you to have all those metrics in place at all times, at the right amount of times, or to have it being exactly in the average all the time. So I think the information is useful for everyone. I think the more it's accessible to everyone, the better it is, because people are aware of how to be more health conscious. But I think if the technology is being judged on how much it's being able to change lifestyles, then with a pinch of salt, but not everyone will be able to utilize these metrics to make changes, because despite their intentions to want to change it, sometimes lifestyle does not permit doing
life gets in the way.
Exactly.
Life gets in the way.
So they, for them, a 40-minute training session is the most that they can do towards being healthy as a goal. If you've got 4 kids and you've got to drop them all to school before you get to that training session, your sleep quality might be the last thing in your list of thinking of what to improve, and that's a reality. So I think it's good in the fact that you're aware of another metric that can potentially help you understand your life as it is. But this is not the be all and the end all of how you approach your health. because it will look different for every single person, and these metrics are currently based on an average, which is normalizing to everyone. So that's something to consider.
My last question, to all the young aspiring researchers out there who are interested in bridging the gap between scientific research and that practical application to the fitness industry, what advice would you give to them?
I'd say don't overcomplicate things. Don't look for the most fancy methodological processes. What you need to answer is a real world problem, and to answer a real world problem you need to figure out how the question can form to help people in the real world, and then look at the most realistic methods that will answer these questions. But get involved with the people that it most affects, get involved with the people that it most applies to, and by doing that you are one step already closer to trying to fix that problem. If you don't have the buy-in of the population that you're trying to help, then it's just another article, it's just another scientific paper which hasn't gone through the processes of reaching some form of agreement between the people that it needs to be applied with. So if you're looking to answer a real life question, get involved with the people that are actually affected by it, understand that process, try to do the hard research that involves being in those natural environments, so that you can eventually have an outcome which is based on a real problem, not a problem, for example, created in a lab artificially.
It's really helpful. Thank you so much.
Well,
Appreciate it.